Alright, now it's time to get into the good stuff. Let's start animating. I'm going to select my project window, hit Apple I for import, and let's grab the CP Spaceman TIFF. Hit OK. Now create a composition. So we'll hit Apple N for new composition, and we'll call this comp keyframe animation. And we'll choose our NTSC DV preset and hit OK. So let's grab our spaceman and drop him into the comp. Okay, so now let's talk about transform animation. Every layer has a series of transform properties, and these are the properties of the layer that you can animate. So if we twirl down this layer in the timeline, you'll see transform, then we twirl that down, and here's all our transform properties: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So if this is the only thing you ever learned about After Effects, you could make an entire career out of just simply animating transform properties. This is probably 90% of what you're going to spend your time doing. So the anchor point. The anchor point you can actually see on the layer. If I zoom in here, this little crosshair doodad that's in the center of the layer. And the anchor point always defaults to the center of the layer. We can move the anchor point, which I'll talk about shortly. But the important thing about the anchor point is it's like the point of reference on the layer. All the other transform properties operate relative to the anchor point. So here's what I mean. If we select scale and scrub our scale, you can see how the layer is scaling around the anchor point. So notice our anchor point property has two numbers. The first number is the X position. The second number is the Y position. X is the horizontal position. Y is the vertical position. So this is how we locate a layer in space, in 2D space. X goes horizontal, Y goes vertical. So 0 on the X, 0 on the Y would be the very first pixel in the top left corner. So the X values get greater as you go from left to right. Y values get greater as you go from top to bottom. So if we only wanted to move a layer vertically or shift the anchor point vertically, we would just shift the Y axis. The X is always the first number, Y is always the second number. So if I scrub the anchor point's Y position, see how it's shifting the layer relative to the anchor point? And I'll just shift it until the anchor point is now at the base of our spaceship. Now watch what happens when I scale the layer. It's no longer scaling around the center of the spaceship. The base of the spaceship stays pinned right where the anchor point is, and it's scaling. The spaceship is scaling down towards the anchor point now. So the position of the anchor point is really important for controlling how the layer is going to behave, how the other transform properties are going to affect the layer. Also notice when I shifted the anchor point, it actually shifted the position of the artwork relative to the anchor point. So I'm going to undo back to, there we go, with the anchor point centered. So now I'll show you, what if we, let's say this was a single layer in a Photoshop document that we had all laid out and everything positioned right where we wanted it in Photoshop, but we needed to shift the anchor point over to this edge on the left hand side, let's say. So we'd come over here and shift the, but now we've actually shifted the layer, and now it doesn't register with all the other layers that we had in our Photoshop file. So, well, if we shifted it 50 pixels to the left, we could shift the position, the layer's position, 50 pixels back in the opposite direction to compensate. Or there's an easier way to do it. I just undid there a couple times to get back to the default. If you look up in your toolbar, you see this strange icon. This is the pan behind tool. So if I select the pan behind tool, what this does is it allows us to grab an anchor point and move it wherever we want without shifting the position of the layer, without visibly shifting the position of the layer. What it's actually doing is it is actually shifting the position in the opposite direction of the anchor point to compensate. So if I grab the anchor point, notice I can drag it around now and my layer is staying still. But if you look at the numbers down there in the timeline, you can see that the anchor point and the position value are changing. So it's automatically shifting our position to compensate for the anchor point. So this is a pretty handy tool. Lets you position your anchor point without shifting the layer. So we can just position the anchor point right on the edge of the spaceship or wherever it is you need the anchor point to be. So that's the pan behind tool. Whoops. So that's the pan behind tool. Very useful tool. So let's move on to the position property. The position property is pretty straightforward, right? It's the position of the layer relative to the comp. So I can move the position of the layer up there, and notice the position values have changed. So you can literally grab and move a layer in the comp window to change the position. I can click and drag to scrub a position value. So now I'm just scrubbing the X value. I'll click the Y value and scrub that. And so to scrub the value, I left click and hold and then drag back and forth. If you just click once in there, you can literally type a value directly into the property. So that's position. Scale, again, pretty straightforward. It's going to scale the layer around the anchor point. This is a TIFF file, which is a raster image, so we want to avoid scaling the layer too far above 100%. See how once it gets scaled up, it gets all ugly and pixelated, and we don't want that to happen. So we'll set that back to 100%. Notice the first 100 is the horizontal scale, and the second number is the vertical scale. And notice this little link. Right now they're locked, so if we change one, the other one automatically changes the same. But if we turn off that little link, that lets us scale the vertical and the horizontal independent of each other. So now we can really stretch and distort our layer. So I'll hit undo to get back to 100%. Then we have rotation. So as I scrub that, you can see how it's rotating the layer around the anchor point. So again, the anchor point's at the center of our little spaceship, so it's rotating around the center. But if I grab my pan behind tool and reposition the anchor point to, say, the tip of the wing or the edge of the spaceship, and then rotate, now see what the difference is in how my spaceship is rotating now. So all of these transform properties operate relative to the anchor point. And finally, we have opacity. So as I scrub that down, our spaceship fades out. It becomes transparent. Now, if you ever want to reset all these parameters to the default, you can click this little reset button that's right at the top of the transform properties. And so that reset all the numbers to the default. Okay, so I've explained what all the transform properties are and how to manipulate them.